In June 1985, two young British climbers arrived in the remote Cordillera Huayhuash range in the Peruvian Andes. Joe Simpson was 25 years old. Simon Yates was 24. They were ambitious, experienced, and hungry for a challenge that would make their names in the mountaineering world. They found it in Sula Grande, a 20,813-foot peak with a fearsome reputation. The mountain's west face had never been climbed. It was a sheer wall of ice and rock, over a mile of vertical terrain that had defeated previous expeditions. Alpine climbing in the 1980s was entering a bold new era. Climbers were pushing the limits of what was possible, tackling routes with minimal equipment, moving fast and light. Simpson and Yates embraced this philosophy. They carried no radios, no backup team, no safety net. It would be just the two of them against the mountain. They established a base camp at the foot of the glacier with a third companion, Richard Hawking, who would wait for their return. Then Simpson and Yates began their ascent. They climbed for 3 days, battling extreme cold, exhaustion, and technical difficulties. On the morning of the 4th day, they reached the summit. They had done the impossible. The west face of Sula Grande had finally been conquered. But getting to the top was only half the journey. They still had to get down. The descent began well. Simpson and Yates started down the North Ridge, a route they hoped would be safer than retreating down the west face. The weather held. They made good progress through the first day, down climbing carefully and rappelling where necessary. But the mountain was not finished with them. On the second day of the descent, disaster struck. Simpson was climbing down a steep ice cliff when his crampon caught. He fell awkwardly, his full weight driving downward onto his right leg. He felt the bones in his knee explode. The impact drove his lower leg up through his knee joint, shattering the connection between tibia and femur. The pain was instantaneous and overwhelming. He screamed into the thin mountain air. When the shock subsided enough for him to assess the damage, he knew immediately how serious it was. His right leg was destroyed, the knee bent at an unnatural angle. He could not stand on it. He could not walk. At 19,000 feet in a remote mountain range with no rescue possible, a broken leg was essentially a death sentence. Climbers in this situation did not survive. The unwritten rule of alpine climbing was brutal but clear. If your partner breaks a leg, you leave them to die. There was no other way. But Simon Yates was not willing to accept that rule.
Simon Yates made a decision that would define both their lives. He would try to lower Simpson down the mountain. It was an almost impossible task. They were still thousands of feet above base camp, on steep terrain, with deteriorating weather closing in. Simpson could not use his leg at all. Every movement sent bolts of agony through his shattered knee. But Yates was determined. He devised a system using 2 ropes tied together, allowing him to lower Simpson 300 feet at a time. Simpson would slide and tumble down the slope, trying to keep his broken leg from catching on the ice. When he reached the end of the rope, Yates would climb down to him, anchor himself, and repeat the process. It was agonizingly slow. It was brutally painful. But it was working. Hour after hour, they descended. The weather worsened. Snow began to fall. Clouds obscured the terrain below. Yates could not see where he was lowering his partner. Simpson could not see what was coming. As darkness fell, they had descended nearly 3,000 feet. They were exhausted, frozen, and running out of options. Then the mountain delivered its cruelest blow. Yates lowered Simpson over a cliff he could not see. Simpson dropped into empty space, dangling over a massive crevasse, unable to climb back up, unable to communicate with his partner. For over an hour, Joe Simpson hung suspended in the void. The rope held, but he could not ascend it. His hands were frozen. His injured leg dangled uselessly. The crevasse yawned beneath him, a bottomless crack in the glacier that would swallow him whole if the rope broke. Above him, Simon Yates faced his own crisis. He was anchored in a shallow seat carved into the snow slope, bearing the full weight of his partner on the rope. But he was slowly being pulled from his position. The snow was too soft. His anchor was failing. He could not pull Simpson up. He could not see what was happening below. He shouted into the storm but received no response. The wind carried his voice away into nothing. The cold was destroying him. His hands were going numb. His strength was fading. He realized with horrible clarity that if he did nothing, they would both die. Simpson would drag him off the mountain. They would fall together into the crevasse, and that would be the end. Yates had a knife on his harness. For nearly an hour, he resisted the thought. But eventually, the choice became unavoidable. He could die with his partner, or he could cut the rope and save himself. In the darkness of the Andean night, Simon Yates cut the rope. Joe Simpson fell. The moment the rope was cut, he plummeted into the crevasse, tumbling through the darkness until he slammed onto an ice ledge deep inside the glacier. The impact knocked him unconscious. When he awoke, he was alone in absolute darkness. The cold was profound, a deep penetrating chill that seemed to emanate from the ice itself. He had no idea where he was. He could not see the walls around him. He could not see the sky above. He fumbled for his headlamp and switched it on. The beam revealed a nightmare. He was on a narrow ice shelf, perhaps 6 feet wide, suspended in the middle of the crevasse. Above him, the walls of ice curved outward, impossibly smooth, unclimbable. Below him, the crevasse continued downward into absolute blackness. He could not see the bottom. He called out for Yates, but there was no answer. He was utterly alone. His broken leg throbbed with a dull, constant agony. He had no food, almost no water, and no way to climb out. Most men in his position would have accepted death. Simpson later admitted that the thought crossed his mind. He could simply lie down on the ice shelf and let the cold take him. It would not take long. But something in him refused to surrender. Simpson made a decision that defied all logic. Instead of trying to climb up, which was impossible, he would go down. Deeper into the crevasse. Into the unknown darkness. It was insane. But he reasoned that the crevasse must have a bottom somewhere, and perhaps, just perhaps, there might be a way out. He had nothing to lose. He began lowering himself off the ice shelf, using the remaining rope still attached to his harness. He descended into the blackness, his headlamp beam barely penetrating the void below. Foot by foot, he dropped deeper into the glacier. The cold intensified. The walls narrowed. He had no idea if he was descending to his death or to salvation. After what felt like an eternity, his feet touched bottom. The crevasse floor was a jumble of ice blocks and compacted snow. And there, in the beam of his headlamp, he saw something that made his heart surge. Light. A faint gray glow coming from somewhere ahead. It was not the top of the crevasse. It was a side passage, a crack where the glacier ice met the mountain rock. Somehow, impossibly, there was a way out. Simpson began to crawl toward the light, dragging his shattered leg behind him. The tunnel was narrow, twisting, filled with obstacles. But it led upward. It led out. It led to life. Joe Simpson emerged from the glacier into a gray dawn. He had been inside the crevasse for nearly 8 hours. The storm had passed. The sky was overcast but calm. He was alive. But his ordeal was far from over. He lay on the glacier surface, gasping, his broken leg screaming with pain after the hours of crawling and dragging. He looked around and recognized where he was, high on the glacier, still miles from base camp. Between him and safety lay a frozen wasteland of crevasses, ice cliffs, and boulder-strewn moraines. For a healthy climber, it would be a challenging day's walk. For Simpson, with his destroyed knee, it seemed impossible. But impossible had lost its meaning. He had already done the impossible by escaping the crevasse. Now he would do it again. He began to move. He could not walk. He could not even stand on his broken leg. So he crawled. He dragged himself forward on his hands and his one good knee, pushing his shattered leg behind him like dead weight. Every movement was agony. The ice tore at his clothing. The cold numbed his hands. His progress was measured in feet, not miles. But he kept moving. He set himself small goals, reach that rock, then the next rock, then the shadow ahead. He refused to think about the total distance. He thought only about the next few yards. Meanwhile, Simon Yates had descended alone through the night, believing his partner was dead. When he reached base camp and told Richard Hawking what had happened, both men were devastated. Yates was consumed with guilt over cutting the rope, even though he knew he had no choice. They waited a day, hoping against hope that somehow Simpson might appear. When he did not, they began packing up camp, preparing to leave. It was the logical thing to do. No one could survive a fall into a crevasse. No one could crawl down a mountain with a shattered leg. Simpson was dead. They would return home with the terrible news. Back on the glacier, Joe Simpson had no idea he was racing against time. He crawled through the first day and into the night, collapsing periodically from exhaustion, then forcing himself to continue. His body was failing. He had not eaten in days. His water was gone. He began eating snow, which lowered his core temperature dangerously. His broken leg had swollen grotesquely, the flesh tight and hot with infection. He developed frostbite on his fingers and face. He hallucinated, hearing voices, seeing figures in the ice that were not there. But still he crawled. Through the second day. Into the second night. Every hour brought him closer to base camp. Every hour brought Yates and Hawking closer to leaving. On the third day, Joe Simpson reached the moraines. The glacier was behind him now, but the terrain was almost worse. Loose boulders. Unstable scree. Deep channels carved by meltwater. Every movement required him to drag his body over and around obstacles that would have been trivial for a walking man. His hands were destroyed, the skin torn away, the fingers blackened with frostbite. His good knee was now bloody and raw from endless crawling. He was beyond exhausted, running on something deeper than physical energy. Sometime in the afternoon, he smelled something unexpected, the latrine at base camp. The smell of human waste, normally repulsive, was the most beautiful thing he had ever experienced. It meant he was close. He dragged himself toward the scent, following it like a beacon. As darkness fell on the third night, he reached the edge of the camp. He could see the tents. He could see figures moving in the lamplight. He tried to shout but could only produce a weak croak. He was not sure anyone would hear him. He was not sure he had the strength to cover the final distance. With the last reserves of his will, he dragged himself forward and called out one final time. This time, someone heard. Simon Yates emerged from a tent and saw a shape crawling toward him through the darkness. Simon Yates ran to his friend. He could not believe what he was seeing. Joe Simpson, the man he had left for dead, the man he had mourned, was crawling toward him through the darkness. Simpson was barely recognizable. He was skeletal, his face gaunt and blackened with frostbite. His clothing hung in tatters. His hands were claws of bloody, frozen flesh. He was delirious, mumbling incoherently. But he was alive. Yates and Hawking carried him into a tent and began the desperate work of keeping him alive until they could get him to help. They gave him water small sips at a time. They wrapped him in sleeping bags. The next morning, they began the agonizing process of evacuating him from the mountain. It took days to get Simpson to a hospital. Doctors told him he would likely lose his leg. He refused to accept it. After multiple surgeries and years of rehabilitation, he kept the leg, though it would never be the same. Joe Simpson went on to write about his experience in a book called Touching the Void, published in 1988. It became one of the most acclaimed mountaineering books ever written, later adapted into a documentary film. The story raised profound questions about survival, partnership, and the ethics of cutting the rope. Simon Yates faced criticism from some in the climbing community, though Simpson always defended his decision. Yates had done what he had to do to survive. Simpson had done the same. Both men continued climbing after the accident. Both men carried the experience with them for the rest of their lives. The mountains never forgot, and neither did they.